Evacuated is a simulation of an evolving forest ecosystem. The underlying computational model is a sort of rule set that produces a certain change and evolution over time, but the system also rewrites its own rules. And as a result, it cannot remember sort of fixed narrative or things that happened before, but it's always in a state of change. And I think what started the project is my interest for a long time already in how we as humans deal with the notion of what lies ahead of us. So the kind of wanting to know the future, but also our fear for the future. And this is not something new. We're now surrounded by all sorts of predictive systems, but this is not something new. Throughout history, we have always created different ways of how to grasp the unknowable, like through magic, acts of God, and now we have statistic and predictive models. The title, The Evacuated, it comes from this idea of being in a sort of state of being evacuated. Whether it's a person, a community, a plant, other species, undergoing this situation of being forced out of their kind of familiar habitat as a space, but also out of their own coherent narrative somehow, so how time unfolds. So in a way, how the evacuated breaks with a sort of linear progression, a linear time, and what it means to be evacuated, what it means to being forced out of that familiar time and space, but also not having arrived, settled, grounded in a new kind of time and space. And what that leaves is a sort of space in between, a kind of condition of not coming from anywhere, not arriving anywhere, and so in this suspension, this sort of, I see it as a sort of catastrophic temporality, and how to work in a project with that. Is it possible even? How would that?
Sure, no, you have to assign.
Yeah.
I mean,
It is nice that the sound really gives a sort of deeper. Oh, maybe 4 then?
I'll normalize this.
A lot of previous work, I've been always trying to understand what it means to model the future. We have so many simulations and models around us, predictive systems that make a claim on the future, models for climate change, financial systems, health systems. And I think specifically this financial product that I worked on for a long time, catastrophe bonds, I think that I think they do a lot to our notion of the future and trying to think about it. Because what happens when the future is already by these financial, derivatives in a way, and insurance products, what happens when the future is already calculated, mapped, and traded as a catastrophe, monetized as a catastrophe? Like, what space does that leave for us being, makers, just citizens, humans, to say or participate in that future? And for me, it's exactly about that, of the sort of impossibility of a future. In a way, I'm interested also in the original meaning of catastrophe, which comes from Greek theater, where it was not necessarily a destructive event, but it kind of meant a reversal or break in the story. And as an artist, I also think a lot about the role of imagination and thinking, other ways. The idea of us creating alternative scenarios. I really try to ask myself if this is in itself not also continuing this linear progressive time, that's completely hijacked by finance in these capitalist systems. Are we not, by producing these speculative scenarios, just operating in a similar way? So with this project, I was trying to find another way and finding another temporality to work with. And I don't think it's even another temporality. I think it's kind of the collapse of a certain understanding of time. Yeah, I'm interested as a maker to not create a system that is built to preserve something or to mimic something, but that in itself tries to really operate and act out this notion of time, and especially not a time that's linear, but a broken time. So the project is started from a real place in the Netherlands, in the northeast polder. And it's located on what used to be a sandbank, former seafloor. And it's submerged above the water when the Zuiderzee was closed. And they left this area alone for a long time. And so there's a sort of wild forest on it right now. But it's also very young. It's only 70 years old, I think. So there is this kind of idea of a sort of wild nature, whatever that may mean in the Netherlands.
Especially in the Netherlands, yeah.
But then inside that forest you have a kind of scientific experiment, a preservation experiment, which is a living gene bank of trees and shrubs. And so inside the wild forest you have these fields with trees all lined up in a grid of different tree species that are all indigenous to the Netherlands. These are indigenous trees that grow in the living gene bank, and we had them scanned and digitized into digital models that are used in the ecosystem. So actual real trees became digital models that are also used in the forest. This kind of historical map is showing the situation of the area where the project kind of originated from, its geographical location. It's a historical map of the former Zuiderzee, and here in black there is the sandbank that used to be more underwater and that sort of submerged, and then we can see it here as well, larger, but now with complete polder around it. This is the area where, there's a big part that they kind of just left alone, where this forest grew on its own. And inside is the scientific experiment, the living gene bank fields. The trees all neatly kind of lined up in rows, categorized according to species. And after interviewing the scientists also working on this gene bank, something really fundamental emerged, I think, in my thinking about preservation and ideas behind this gene bank. Because she said something to the effect of we have to keep these, the gene bank itself and the fields and the trees as static as possible. Evacuated started initially when I, discovered and researched this gene bank, as I wanted to create this sort of digital twin, and think about what is the future of this gene bank that in itself is also subjected to all sorts of environmental threats because it's actually a living, gene bank. It's not a seed bank or something. But what I'm mostly interested in is how the catastrophe operates within the system, like as a process. So when the forest evolves but it overrides itself, there is this kind of catastrophic process in a way of the system not sort of trying to create fixed narratives and memory that it can go back to, but it constantly overrides itself. So the catastrophic is not just some sort of visual moment in the forest's sort of life cycle, but it's also how the system, the simulation underlying it kind of evolves.
Yeah, what do you think? Because it's funny because it's so not natural.
Do you think that this is the wind? Do you see the wind?
No, the wind's on 1, 2, 2.
But it's moving, right?
Yeah, it's right.
Whoa, the tree in the back, look, this, is another one spawned in it?
Is it
It looks
two,
really
Probably the foliage there.
It's also there, the normals are not, it's actually adjusted with the normals. You know how when you sample the surface, it will get the normal as well. So when you put the tree on
Also like
that is,
But I did it for the
grams.
foliage.
Is the spawning of the trees on these hills, it doesn't correct for the
Yeah, that's what I was
verticality?
just saying,
Okay.
yeah.
But that's a piece of
You see that one? Where's this one single dead tree? Is it? There was a dead tree in the middle of nowhere. It was a spruce. Oh yeah, we moved to spruce. Yeah, okay. No, but it was a transition. I think what I'm questioning and searching for is what happens to our understanding of memory and time when the idea of sort of linear progressive time collapses. And I think the answer, the way how I try to find answers is by creating this forest, this system that somehow is not a representation of a time, but that in itself produces a new time. It runs time, you could say. And so in a way, it's also really about trying to create an experience that doesn't have this kind of narrative flow, or like that you know where you're going, or as things seem coherent. It's in a way just the forest is performing itself, it's rewriting itself. Sometimes things seem coherent, sometimes you might link cause and effect, but it's not intended like that. The system doesn't try to create meaning or tell you something. It's just sort of performing itself. Yeah, and I think because the system is sort of looping, there is recursion, so there's feedback loops, it goes back and forth, and you as a viewer have quite you're in a sort of temporal fog, like you don't really understand or know where it's going. I think the only thing you can experience is this notion of being somewhere in the middle and trying to grasp what is going on. I think it's also interesting because it's something that happens all the time when talking about this project. We refer to it as the forest, but of course it's a complete computational system. It's not a biological forest, obviously. And maybe to refer also a bit, or to break open this notion of forest, I think what for me is interesting about the forest, for me is as much a kind of biological, ecological sort of context on the one hand, but a forest is also for me really a kind of model of the mind somehow, you know. It's a sort of mental landscape, you know, where we project all our anxieties and fears also in, you know. Even from when we're a child, the forest represents some sort of something wild or something unknown, something dangerous. But then the system itself is completely computational, you know, so it's based on rules, you know, it's coded. In the end, it is just a computational system. It's a simulation that is driven by rules, rules that are on the one hand inspired by biological rules, so there's many different parameters of how in the simulation the sort of air quality, the soil quality affects the kind of development of a certain area, which species grow there, how those tree species might affect the insects that are in that area, how those insects trigger certain plants to be there. So there's that component, but it's not just the kind of scientific simulation, you know, we also bring all these other parameters like superstition, for example, like other belief systems, like magic or gods, so that bring in certain dynamics into the simulation that are not sort of realistic, coming from a sort of biological simulation. And so we have that kind of basic system that, you know, these rules execute itself, but that along the way, if it somehow optimizes or it finds a more optimal way, the system of how it thinks it should evolve, it can change its own rules. What's important to say about the project is that, you know, I'm speaking here about the project, but it's, you know, obviously a team effort, you know. It's a group, a small group, a tiny group of close collaborators where we kind of started this project also thinking we have an idea how to build it, and then, you know, constantly had to redefine it because the project runs for multiple years. It's also a sort of it grows with you in a way, you know. You start at one point, but then maybe through things happening to your life or happening to the members of the team, you also start to look at the project and the ideas that are embedded within the project in a different way, you know. The notion of preservation of life, or maybe finding ways of how to let go of things, or accepting that you have to let go of things. I think all these notions also became a part of the project somehow. Yeah. So yeah, the project also traces a kind of, I'd say, a group of makers that go through several things, and then it's a constant sort of feedback loops also into the project, into the concept, into its execution. And the project is really, as I said, a team effort. Like Gabor Szalatnyai, my close collaborator and partner, he worked on the simulation, which is also a very complex thing to work on, because again, you can never have a kind of overview, only partial perspective. And then I worked with someone like Jacco Kooistra, very much on the artistic side of the project. And then BJ Nilsen, a sound artist and composer, with whom I worked already for a long time. Yeah, we think a lot about what would this forest that is not, you know, it's not a forest where you walk into nature, but that you experience in a different way. What would it sound like? How can the sound in itself also be almost like a kind of actor, an entity on its own that roams through the forest, rather than it being a sort of, you know, sound made for the forest? you know, that's the kind of drama you cannot imagine up front. You know, that's nice. Yeah. It's life in itself, right? This is like, it's how life works.
So much of it is coming to that.
Yeah. No, I think that's also the thing you really realize, like, especially like, you know, you can have these periods in your life that seem completely absurd and like, oh my God, how did this happen? How come all these things end up in the same moment, you know? And of course, there's not a kind of master plan behind it. And I think that is in a way, you try to give meaning to it, you know, by making, that's how you can deal with it, by somehow putting meaning into it. But of course, it's a complete sort of, clusterfuck, I would say, but a mashup of coincidences, I guess, that is really interesting to experiment within this project. It's interesting is that for a long time, when you work on the project, when you start to set it up, you have to have all these assumptions, and based on that, you're gonna develop the simulation, you're gonna define all the parameters. But a lot is based on assumption, and you have to, I think you have to jump in the deep. But now when the forest is there, the system, and it's kind of, you know, performs itself, and it starts to also say things back at you that you did not really know it would be able to say. I think that's interesting. So it becomes more, you put a lot into it, into this project, into developing this complex system, and now it starts to throw things back at you. Yeah, I think what for me is really interesting about the project is that it started like this, you know, big endeavor of how to set up a simulation, how to technically do this. You know, you have to define rules and parameters of how to build the system. So it's a lot of kind of planning, scheming, considering, like, and then you build the system. And then now when it runs, you know, you look at it and it starts to show you things that some you expected, a lot also you didn't expect or didn't know it could do that. And so that's for me interesting, where on the one hand the project presents a trace of, you know, ideas of the people working on it, but it's no longer only just a trace, it's also, it somehow has its own, I wouldn't say use the word story, but it has its own sort of thing to say or tell, not with an intention, but it just shows you something. And then when looking at it, this is how I experience it. Like, I kind of let go of trying to find meaning in it. I just sort of try to, I just surrender to this kind of flow and experience it. And I think, and listen to it, and I think so that is interesting, that you go from this really like rational process, you know, where prediction is also very much rooted, and of course, you know, trying to, at least in our current times with statistics and models, you go from this rational moment into something very visceral, you know, where you're looking at something and it affects you, but you don't really know how. Like, I can also not really say what I have seen often, or, you know, your mind just drifts off. It's this kind of more stronger bodily experience, and I think that is now really nice to experience this part of the project, to look at it, start looking at it,